what I do, Humanistic Judaism, I think we're going to get into some hopefully really big issues like belief and identity, and maybe even ethnicity, multiculturalism. I'm happy to go in any of the directions. And what I thought we would do is let me throw some stuff out at you for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and then just spend the rest of the time kind of dialoguing, if that's okay with everybody. So as mentioned, I'm executive director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. We are the umbrella organization for a denomination of American Judaism. So we are similar in structure to Reconstructing Judaism. We are much smaller. We're the smallest denomination. And we were founded almost 60 years ago by a rabbi named Sherwin Wine in suburban Detroit. He was ordained in the Reform movement. The Reform movement in the 50s was dramatically less religious than it is today. And he never described himself as atheist, but he was labeled the atheist rabbi by Newsweek in a blurb. It got a little bit of notoriety. This was after he founded a congregation in suburban Detroit in which, and this is the main innovation of our movement, he rewrote the liturgy. And I know that, you know, those of you in Reconstructionist Judaism understand, you know, your liturgy was, things were omitted. Rabbi Kaplan didn't want to say certain things. And that was a radical move at that time. Rabbi Wine replaced all mention of God and the supernatural from the liturgy and overlaid it with humanism, a philosophy. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but the idea of secular Judaism was not new by 1963 or 64. You know, there had been secular Jews since Enlightenment. Some of you may also know of your own family members. My grandparents were in the Labor Bund in Poland before World War II. That was not only secular, it was secularist, it was secularizing, you know, and that was something that was happening in the early 20th century in large swaths of the Jewish community. So, and there are organizations today like the Workmen's Circle, which is now called the Workers' Circle, that traces, and it's a 120-year-old organization, it traces its roots to secular Judaism. So Humanistic Judaism was on that path, but then split off by overlaying this philosophy of humanism onto the liturgy. And humanism, I think if you go Google it and look at it in Wikipedia, I don't think there's anything that Reconstructionist Jews would disagree with. Basically, it is the idea that we can't wait for divine intervention. It's on us to make the world a better place, to improve our lives, to use the best of human reason and logic and empathy and positive values to make the world a better place. You know, and that the focus is on humans having the power to make that change. So I don't think that there's any disagreement about that, but the removing of God from the liturgy certainly got a lot of pushback by organized Judaism in the 60s when it was really radical. And even today, a lot of people are not necessarily comfortable with the idea. So why did we do it? What do we do with that? We still do Jewish holidays. We still celebrate Jewish life cycle events. We still educate our kids Jewishly. And I think if you walk through the doors of one of our communities to experience a Shabbat service, you would still recognize it. It would feel familiar and it would feel Jewish. And then you would realize, okay, these words are different. These are changed. And the bottom line was, and you know, Rabbi Sherwin Wine said, I can no longer bring myself to say these words that I don't believe. I want to say words that I believe. And I think that that's the kind of attraction for most of the people who have been through our movement. And I feel strongly that over these past almost 60 years, probably tens of thousands of Jewish households remained connected to Jewish life because they had that outlet when otherwise they would have walked away. Millions of Jews over the last 60 years have just walked away from religious Judaism. This group of people said, I still want to celebrate the holidays. I still have a strong Jewish identity. Knowing that there's this option of being able to use words that actually describe what I believe was compelling to this small group of people. Now, we can talk about this. I grew up in the conservative movement. I think there's a lot of similarities between the liturgy used in the conservative movement and the Reconstructionist movement. And maybe some of you also grew up in the conservative movement. It was the dominant denomination in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I remember before bar mitzvah feeling very isolated because there was no outlet for me to talk about what I believed. And the appearance of the synagogue community was, this is what we believe, right? We're all saying these words, we're all praying to this God, and there's no conversation about why. So the presumption was, for me, looking around, that, oh, this is what I'm supposed to believe. But what if I don't? And I had nowhere to go with that at that time. I didn't know about what was happening in suburban Detroit with Rabbi Sherman Wine. And I felt very isolated. And there was a strong likelihood that I would have been one of those people who walked away from Judaism, but I didn't because of the cultural connections that my family had to Judaism. So that kind of drives the work that I do. And I would say that along with this innovation of changing the liturgy, which could simply be seen as kind of cosmetic, something much more profound is actually happening by doing that. It wasn't just about the words, it wasn't just semantical. It was the whole view of what is Judaism. And of course, Mordechai Kaplan called Judaism a civilization. Sherman Wine called it a culture in which religion is just one aspect of that much larger culture. So for me, approaching my Jewish identity as a cultural identity rather than a religious identity dramatically changes my relationship, I think, to other people in the world. Because when you look at culture, separated from religion, there's no zero-sum game. And, Abraham and Sharon, thankfully, are providing a beautiful example of this, because behind them are objects from cultures around the world, and there's no zero-sum game. They don't have to lessen their Jewish identity to appreciate and maybe even engage in and participate in the cultures from all around the world. And that changes things a lot. So my wife is from Japan. She's not Jewish. And intermarriage was intertwined when I was growing up with belief. Because again, the messages I was getting, and this was the 70s and early 80s, was marry Jewish. I got also the messages of everyone is equal. Judge everybody as an individual. Don't judge them based on race or religion, except when it comes time to marriage, and then judge them very much so, and make sure that they're Jewish. And and I was hearing this from my liberal-minded parents, but also from the community I was in regularly. And that was a disconnect. And I didn't believe it. I didn't believe what I was hearing. Even then, I went to public school. I knew my girls that I liked who were Jewish, girls who I liked that weren't Jewish. And that disconnect also kind of pushed me away from religious Judaism. I was secular way before I got intermarried. But there's an overlapping there. There's an intertwining. And the intertwining is universalism and recognizing that all people are equal. And again, Mordechai Kaplan took the radical step of removing the notion of chosenness, right? And that was a big step toward this idea of, no, we're all humans. That is a radical departure from where humanity had been for thousands of years. So all of this so to me, it's not just, oh, we changed the words. It is, we have a different approach to Judaism than much of religious Judaism. We have a cultural approach to Judaism, but we still want to do the holidays. We still want to do bar and bat mitzvah. We want to celebrate our Jewish identities, but we want to do it in a cultural expression. And so in my household, We can do as much Japanese as we want. My kids are learning Japanese. There's no conflict there. When they get a little older, they'll begin Jewish education in preparation for bar and bat mitzvah. And I hope that they will feel as strongly Jewish and as strongly Japanese and as strongly American as provides meaning for them. And if it doesn't provide meaning for them, I'll be a little sad if they don't feel any connection to Judaism at this point. And my son is 8, my daughter's 5. I'm pretty confident that my daughter is already describing herself as Jewish. She takes piano lessons, and she just got like level 2 book, and she saw the dreidel song in the book. And I heard her say to her teacher, they're doing it on Zoom, of course. She recognized the song and she says, "I'm Jewish." She was so excited to have that connection. So I feel like we're getting there. But even if they said, like, let's say, so my wife is from Japan. We go to Japan, her parents are still there. And let's say after college, my kids decide to move back to Japan and they marry somebody in Japan and they have kids there. And it turns out that their Jewish lineage was kind of a blip in what was actually a Japanese story. I'll feel sad to some degree. I'll feel some kind of loss, but ultimately it's so much further down on my list of wants for my kids. You know, the highest one being health, and then fulfillment, and them being a good people, you know, all of these kind of universalist values, and then maybe like 7 or 8 that they feel some connection to Jewish identity. And I recognize that many people in the Jewish community would feel very sad and uncomfortable to hear that my highest priority isn't the continuity of the Jewish people. And I get that. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, and I was very close to her, and that also drives my Jewish identity. But ultimately, universalism to me is a stronger pull, even though I'm also very pulled by my Jewish identity. So I want to share my screen very briefly. I have just a couple of slides I wanted to show you. And one of them is the numbers. You know, how big a phenomenon is this that we're talking about? So the Pew Foundation did a survey of American Jews that you may have heard of that came out in 2013, and they're actually working on a new one that's going to come out this year. So that'll add drama to Jewish communal professionals' lives. But they asked what was basically a 2-part question. And part 1 was, do you believe in God? And simple yes or no. And flat out, 28% of American Jews said no, which is dramatically higher than US adults in general. So if you look all the way over to the right, you see, do not believe in God, 28% of Jews, 9% of US adults. And then if you look all the way over to the left, how the follow-up question to those people who said, yes, I believe in God, was, how certain are you in this belief? And absolutely certain, only 34% of Jews said absolutely certain. And the reason I say only 34% is because 69% of all American adults say they're absolutely certain in their belief in God. And to me, the interesting answers fall somewhere in the middle. So of the rest, 24% of Jews said they're fairly certain in their belief. 10% said not too certain, 3% not at all, 1% didn't answer. If you add up the not too certain, not at all, didn't answer, do not believe in God, you've got 42% of American Jews who say they're not sure or they don't believe in God. That's a huge percentage. You would not get that sense if you were a casual observer of the organized Jewish community, the people who speak on behalf of the Jews. And even fairly certain, obviously Pew doesn't get into what do you mean when you say God? So that becomes a question for us to discuss. You know, what do we mean? I feel like it's really important to define the words that we use when those words can be used by different people to mean different things. I call myself an atheist, but I want to be specific about what I don't believe, because atheism says that you don't believe in God. But I want to be clear, I don't believe in the God of the Bible. I would argue a majority of Jews don't believe in the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is completely contradictory. And so when you start from that point of not believing in the God of the Bible, it just opens up the conversation if you are able to kind of define what it is we are and are not talking about. As far as the mysteries of the universe, of course, I feel agnostic. I don't know, because I don't think anybody really knows. And I feel like that might be the common ground that we can all come to on what do we and don't we know. And maybe we want to believe in something, and that's okay. But that's agnostic too, right? Because you're saying, I want to believe in that, but I don't know, and I say, I don't believe in it, but I don't know either. So there is a commonality there. And I think that a lot of folks, including in my movement, particularly from the generation older than me, have a real adverse reaction to the word atheist. I feel that word is much more neutral in generations younger than me, but in older generations, it has like almost a visceral reaction of, how can you be so sure of yourself, and or atheists were those godless communists that we heard about every single day, for decades. So we don't want to use that word. The word humanist is what we officially use in our movement. And again, that, to me, the reason I like it is because that stands for positive values. To me, atheist simply says what I don't believe. And humanism says what I do believe. So that's how I approach those terms. If you hear me use those terms, I just want to be clear on where I'm coming from. Other people may use those words differently. So to dig in on one more statistic from the Pew survey, they asked what's essential to being Jewish. Now, most of the focus from the Pew study was on intermarriage, how many Jews observe Shabbat, a lot of these traditional measures. And I couldn't believe this wasn't the most glaring numbers to come out of that study for Jewish communal professionals, because it said, you can see that red arrow, what's essential to being Jewish, only 28% of Jews said being part of a Jewish community is essential to being Jewish. As a Jewish communal professional, that's my business. I can't believe how low that is and why this wasn't the most urgent and disturbing statistic coming out of the Pew survey. And I can't help but think that a big piece of the reason why people are not connecting to the organized Jewish life is because of the lack of conversation about what we do and don't believe, and whether or not this is open to people who doubt, let alone don't believe, but who doubt. And again, I think it's very much intertwined with intermarriage, because only a small percentage of those who are intermarried are deeply believing Jews married to deeply believing Christians or other religions. It happens, I know some, but for the most part, you're talking about two mostly secular people who want to hold on to the culture and connections of their different religions, or not. But to me, those are also intertwined topics. So as an example of how the liturgy is different in our movement, well, this is an original piece that was written by Rabbi Sherwin-Wine that is like our Shema. We do have a secular Shema, but this is the one that if you attend one of our services, you'll see the longtime people really be roused by this, our, most used original piece of liturgy. Where's my light? My light is in me. Where's my hope? My hope is in me. Where's my strength? My strength is in me and in you. So basically, still the themes that people are looking for from religion. And we are categorized as a non-theistic religion. Before we started, someone mentioned ethical culture. That is another non-theistic religion. There are a few more non-theistic religions out there. But the themes are intended to be comforting, inspirational, exactly what people look for in religious community, but referencing the human experience, that hope and strength comes from us, from each other, and toward each other. This is a handout that we did this past Hanukkah, but this is a blessing, the most used blessing, because it's the Hanukkah candles, and then the Shabbat candles are just one word different at the end. But it's Baruch HaOr Ba'olam, Baruch HaOr Ba'adam, Baruch HaOr B'Chanukah, or Shabbat. Radiant is the light in the world, radiant is the light within each person, radiant is the light of Hanukkah. And frankly, even using the word light to me sounds a little woo-woo because I'm so hardcore, not touchy-feely, but we want to appeal to a broad crowd, and we need a word, and we want to talk about things that inspire, and we acknowledge that emotion and human values and thoughts are not tangible things, even for those of us who believe that, we're basically all just walking meat sacks. There is something special that we want to acknowledge about the human experience. And even if it's all chemical reactions in my brain, I feel spiritual when I look at the ocean. Like right outside this door is the woods, and I feel something. I feel this connection to nature that I don't really get to experience that much in Brooklyn. And so I seek those experiences out. I just happen to believe that those are all things that are happening in the chemistry and biology of my body, and they're not something that enters into me from the spirit world. And maybe you feel the same way, maybe you feel differently. I try not to be judgmental. I just want to be able to share what I believe, because as I showed you with the statistics, I know a lot of other people think the way that I do, and we don't have the voice for it in the organized Jewish community. And we still want to be a part of the organized Jewish community. And I was invited to speak here today because I was included, along with the rabbi of our New York City congregation, to speak at a day of learning from the Reconstructionist movement about God. And I feel like it demonstrates such a position of strength, of intellectualism in your movement to be able to include us, whereas I feel like some of the other denominations would feel threatened by having this conversation. So I was honored to be included in that conversation, and I think that you guys are way ahead of the curve as far as the other denominations go in facilitating these kind of talks. And so I'll stop there and I'll open it up. And if there's aspects of what I mentioned that you would like to go off on in a tangent, I'm happy to, have that conversation.
I have a question for you. I learned from Rabbi Diana that one of her favorite teachers at the Rabbinical College used the term "God is a verb." What do you think about that?
Actually, it was David Cooper, but may his memory be for a blessing. He wasn't at the Rabbinical College. He was a mystical kind of renewal rabbi who recently passed away.
Mm-hmm. So here's the thing. In order to explain our movement, I have to focus on the differences, when in the reality, the Venn diagram between the folks in our movement and the folks in Reconstructionist Judaism, reconstructing Judaism, is almost complete overlapping as far as the way we act in the world, our values, our politics, even in a lot of ways. So unfortunately, my talk is going to be about what's different. And I just want to say that for the most part, I think we're all on the same page. But my challenge in rebranding the word God, and that's really what it is, because that's not the God of the Bible, right? Remember, I talked about the God of the Bible, or maybe it's an aspect of the God of the Bible, but the challenge for me is that most of our fellow Americans, when they hear the word God, are thinking of the God of the Bible. So if most of our Americans are thinking about that biblical God, when we say God, I'm just concerned that we're not going to succeed in rebranding God to mean the liberal God, right? To me, it's politics. There's no way to separate religion from politics. And so my concern is that, the phrase, we were all created in God's image, that kicks off 1,000 Jewish social justice activities, right? It kicks off the Religious Action Center's platform on LGBTQ equality. Now, all of us, I would guess, are for LGBTQ equality. And to me, it's just a question of approach. When we say we're all created in God's image, that alienates me, and that's being used by the folks on the far right to discriminate against LGBTQ equality. So I really wonder, how do we convince them? But again, I'm a secularist. I am promoting secularity in aspects of my work. I'm mostly trying to reach people who are secularist and don't have an outlet for it. But I genuinely believe that it's better to make the case for LGBTQ equality based on science than it is based on religion, because the words are in our tradition, and they're used very selectively by our opponents on these issues. And I'd rather argue with them on the science and the ethics, the humanist ethics. And I would also kind of argue that liberal Judaism is actually informed by humanism without saying so, and then they go back and fill in the God language. So God is a verb. Okay, I'd rather say good. I'd rather just say goodness. Let's be good. Let's do the right thing. And, let's base our values on ethics as we understand them today. I don't need the divine stamp to say this is ethical. Diana.
So I have a few things to say about this, and I will stick with the LGBTQ for a moment, which is that I see how we do or don't relate to God as an orientation as natural as all the different spectrums on the gender spectrum and on the sexual orientation spectrum. So I happen to have like a deep love and yearning for the divine and surrendering to the divine, and you happen to have not that, and yet we probably share 99% of politics and worldview and ethics. But I would say for me, it's really useful to think of everyone being in God's image, including everyone who's trans and gay and straight and everything else. That helps me see that everything that is here was created and intended to be here. That's what my soul needs. But so I guess I feel like, I wonder if there's an orthodoxy, as it were, within secularism that doesn't allow for my very progressive and liberal ethic to need and want and desire that God language for the same thing that you don't want it for fear of right-wing people using it. Like, is there room in your worldview for a religious progressive God language using Jew?
Of course. Because that is who dominates Jewish progressive spaces. I can't not have it and be a part of the Jewish community. Do you understand?
Yeah.
SHJ is part of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable, and I'm the only secular person around that table, or at least the only openly secular one, the only person who keeps my mouth shut when we say the prayer. And so that space is there already, and it's made. So I'm pushing for us to be included. So I hear what you're saying.
I'll say one more thing, and then I'll be quiet because there's so many other people here. As a rabbi, I think that pew question is ridiculous. Do you believe in God or not? That is so uninteresting. We learn nothing from that. When I talk to a bar mitzvah student, I'm completely open to whatever their paradigm is of the world, whether it's completely no God or what does God mean to you? Why are we here? What's the purpose? And whatever they say great. There's a whole history of Jews that fall right into that. You are completely part of the Jewish people. So in other words, like, your position, Paul, makes so much sense to me. Like, it's not my position, but like, that's part of the Jewish people. Like, hello, there's a huge history of many, many forms of non-believers who are deeply into Yiddishkeit in Judaism. So I value what you're doing. And I personally feel that my idea of Reconstructionism absolutely is big tent enough to hold atheists, agnostics, etc.
Yeah, and I won't claim that humanistic Judaism is big tent. And in fact, before I came to SHJ, 5 years ago, I worked for 16 years at an organization that was actually called Big Tent Judaism, and I worked in pluralistic settings, and I consulted with synagogues and organizations all across the spectrum. And so I very much value and recognize that, again, these differences in the larger picture of what has to get fixed in the world are quibbles to some degree. And I totally appreciate your approach. And maybe even, would feel comfortable in your community if I live nearby. And I appreciate that. But, and I know you're probably not gonna like hearing this, but you're coming at it from a position of religious privilege. And I wanna use that word very purposefully, that religion in the organized Jewish community has privilege. And maybe that's as it should be, and the organized Jewish community may argue this is our space for it. But the reason why I'm so glad that Pew does ask that question is because I felt pushed out, I felt isolated, and then I see that more than a quarter of my fellow Jews feel as I do. And I have to ask, why did I feel so pushed out if we're more than a quarter of the people? Where's our space? Where's our voice? And I showed you the example of a secular blessing. I still call it a blessing. Some folks in my movement don't want to use that word, but I'm okay with it. And I very rarely, or pretty much, like, federations are pluralistic umbrella groups. They do events. They may say a blessing. They're never going to use our blessing alongside the religious blessing, even if I ask them to. One time, PJ Library, the organization that gives out free books to kids, they sent a poster out a few years back for Shabbat, and they included a humanistic blessing alongside a theistic blessing, right? So if we want to claim pluralism, that would be a way to say to secular and atheist and agnostic and free thinker Jews and humanists, you're included. We don't have to agree on it, but we're at least going to name you. We're going to include you in our options. And right now, we're just not included. The Forward did over the summer during COVID, they did this major series where Abigail Pogrovin interviewed 18 Jewish thought leaders. I think 17 of them were rabbis. And the spectrum was Orthodox, taking it all literally, Noah's Ark actually happened, all the way to almost agnostic. And that's when they stopped. And when asked why you didn't include a rabbi, she knows about our movement and she knows that we have rabbis who will call themselves atheists. She said, we were really exploring the gray area. We weren't interested so much in the black and white. But they had a guy who flat out said, Noah's Ark is history. I can't think of a more black and white approach than that. So all I'm asking for is the recognition that even if you are the most inclusive theistic rabbi to non-believers, the power dynamic in the Jewish community is still theism to include non-theism. And this dynamic works, again, for intermarried families. We welcome you. Reconstructionism, again, as always, way out in front of the other theistic movements as far as like ordaining rabbis who are in interfaith marriages. But that wasn't easy. That was a tension. There was people objected to that. And those kind of things is about, to me, there's aspects of privilege there that those are the intermarried. There are more intermarried households in America today than there are in married households. So if it was a democracy, the privilege would be among intermarried, and we can get up on the pulpit and say, multiculturalism is good. You Jewish kids should marry someone who's not Jewish so that there's more multicultural understanding in the world, right? I'd go to that rabbi's sermon, but we're not going to necessarily hear that in any denominations. And in our denomination, we would say it's equally good. We wouldn't say it's better. But those are the kind of things I see as someone who very much feels like an outsider from the organized Jewish communities, that even like pluralistic settings like Jewish community centers and federations, they're still using the traditional liturgy, and they're not saying beforehand, God is a metaphor, or use the word however you feel. Sometimes someone says that, but anyway. So I hear what you're saying, and I hope I'm explaining this in a kind of as inclusive a way as I can, because I really go back and forth on this. I carry baggage from being hurt in the Jewish community that I grew up in, of not feeling included or acknowledged, or I felt isolated, and I carry a chip on my shoulder about that, and I just want to be honest about it. Somebody else who hasn't spoken yet? Judy?
I apologize. I was a little late coming on. I'm sorry. I really respect that you've done this, because I came from a conservative as well. And my parents were survivors, and I'm in intermarriage. And it was, I think I'm older than you, and it was literally hell when I got married. There's a lot, yet in my family, I'm the one who's considered the rabbi, because I'm the one who has all the passion for Judaism. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you've done this for so many people who have been aching and wanting to. And we're very lucky. We have Rabbi Diana. I consider her like someone, like, of all the rabbis I've ever had in my life, there's no one like Rabbi Diana. But in California, where my daughter lives, I almost found that there was a form of Judaism for as many Californians as you could find in the Berkeley area. You could call it whatever you wanted, but every kind of, so I guess my question to you is this: is it really about whether you hold to Judaism with or without God? Or is it really about how you just care to frame Judaism, whatever way it is? And that the freedom to be able to say with pride, I am a Jew, the way I want to be a Jew. For me, I love the Torah. Do I agree? I mean, we had a Torah study where I seconded Abraham. We should get rid of Leviticus sections. We don't want it in there anymore. Let's edit the Torah. I mean, Rabbi wasn't for it, but, there were a few of us who wanted to do that. But I still love the Torah. And I still find that I need a lot of those things. So I might not understand things by the time I die, but I don't want them to not be there for my children and my grandchildren to figure it out for themselves. So I'm a little worried when you remove God from the conversation. It's like editing anything. Once you edit, you remove, your children don't have the opportunity to, or my granddaughter who lives in Berkeley, I mean, in her preschool, she was visiting Israel. She told me the other day, I said, was it pretend or real? She said, oh no, we were really there. They're 5. So
that's great. So I totally share. Yeah, I totally.
When you edit God out, so do you actually do that? Or is there still an opportunity for people who, like, I would have wanted to belong at the time if I didn't have Rabbi Diana, where I happen to be, but I wouldn't have wanted to throw out my Torah.
So here is where we have, I think, complete agreement. I think about, so first of all, I had mentioned that if you go to one of our services, it would be familiar and yet different. Our one physical temple is out in suburban Detroit, where Rabbi Sherwin had his pulpit. And if you go there, you would notice that they don't call it the sanctuary, but the sanctuary, there's no ark. But they do have a Torah, and it's not edited. They have an actual Torah. It's in the library. It's in a place of honor in the library. And he said, this is a book. This is a really important book. It's a foundational book for our people, but it goes in the library, and we're not going to revere it. We're not going to march it around and kiss it. We're not going to put crowns on it, but we're going to study it. And so secular Torah study happens everywhere in our movements, and we're using the actual words. But I hear what you're saying. And all of ours is still a relatively new movement. And I've seen it done badly. I went to a secular community in Philadelphia, not affiliated with our movement, but they call themselves humanist. I went to their Passover Seder, And they went through the Haggadah that they made themselves, and they told the story of Passover, and they cut God out of it. But they still had the parting of the sea. And it said, Moses put his hands up and the sea parted. And I thought to myself, so wait, now Moses is magic? It's like, if you're going to have it, just tell the story and then talk about it, right? But they redacted God from it, and then it was Moses who had the magical power. Like, that made no sense to me. So and not just Torah study, we do in New York, they do secular Talmud study too. And again, it's like, what is the approach that we're taking, which is that this was written by men, and I'm saying men and not people, because I think it was almost all written by men, and many thousands of years ago, doing the best they had with the information that they had at the time. And some of it is radical. Shabbat is an amazing invention that we can be proud of, like all of these things. But once we put that into context, we can dig in and say, is this still ethical today? Does this improve my life? Does this inform the way I do things? So that's the kind of thing that I absolutely want to still connect to. I'll just say one thing, which is, like, I've been to the Acropolis in Athens, and I've been to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and both were amazing and profound. And I know the impact that ancient Greek culture had on the world and on me, and likewise Judaism. But being at the wall was so much more profound, because that's mine, right? That's my history. That's my connection. So it's not just that the Torah is a book, it's our book, right? And so there is something more important about it and higher about it. And I think the people in our movement feel that way as well. But we just want to come at it with the ability to be honest and say, this was not dictated from God to Moses. And once you say that, then all that stuff in Leviticus, to me, it's fascinating to try to figure out what was happening at that time with our ancestors. I can't prove they were my ancestors, but I'm going on the presumption that they were. Or even, if you have chosen Judaism, that you are adopting them as your ancestors. I want to understand it, but I want to start from that position. Someone else want to jump in?
KHN, this is so unlike you. Talk.
All right, I have a question. So when you have a service and you're davening, you're praying, you're getting together and celebrating humanity, how is that different from reading a good book together and celebrating a good story that's not religiously inspired? It's not that. So how is there a difference between the mundane and the religious?
There is not. We don't call it praying, even though we're using a liturgy, because it feels like prayers are going at somebody or something. But to me, the goal is to have an emotional experience, or even I'm still okay using the word spiritual. Many people in my movement don't want me to say it because it has the word spirit in it. Again, I want to define my words. Spirituality for me is a positive emotional experience that are chemical reactions in my brain, but I seek them out. So if it's done well, then Shabbat services, holiday celebrations should make you feel better afterwards than they did beforehand. And this is something I have said. Like I said, I was basically a consultant to boards I've consulted with like 500 synagogue boards in all the denominations, maybe one or two liberal Orthodox. And I put it to all of them. Why do Shabbat? Why should people come to Shabbat? And if I've never heard that it's our obligation to God. I've never heard that answer. Everyone acknowledges that coming together is about the human experience, which is, to me, humanism. But what should happen? And to me, what should happen is that people feel better or comforted or filled with the courage to go on with their week, or refreshed after a difficult week. Something should change for people from before they enter to after they leave. And that can happen with secular liturgy, but it could also happen with a great author reading, right? So to me, being in the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is as spiritual an experience as I get. And frankly, I've had way less spiritual experiences at Yom Kippur services my whole life than visiting the Metropolitan Museum or hearing an amazing concert, right? To me, music is what moves you, and that can be challenging. I went to our community in Connecticut for Rosh Hashanah one year, and then I talked to the community the next day, and I said, most of you came last night. What did it do for you? Like, what was the impact? And different people talked about different things. One of them said, frankly, I don't care about the liturgy at all. I came because this person sitting next to me came, and I want to see them, and I like them. Another person said, I came for the music. The words, the poetry doesn't do a thing for me. It's the music. And literally the very next person said, I can't stand the music. I come for the poetry. And I'm pulling my hair out because I'm supposed to engage more people in this. And there's no one answer for why anybody comes to services. There's like 10. And in today's day and age, it's really hard to be all things to all people. Things have become so specialized. Maybe you guys do it. A lot of communities now, they do like first Friday is their musical Shabbat. And they're just going to do music from beginning to end. And it's their most popular Shabbat of the month. And then I asked the rabbi, well, how come you don't do it every single Shabbat then if it's most popular? And they know that some people don't come because that's not what they want. And they think it'll become too common. And the reality is, for liberal Jews, coming to Shabbat once a month is a major accomplishment. I don't go every month. And that again relates to secularity, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, enough. Because there's this other piece, which is obligation, which I don't think most of us on this call feel, but that fired connection to organized Jewish life for many people, for my parents' generation and older, that this is what Jews do. My folks, for many years, were not active in their synagogue community, but paid membership because they were always going to be members, but they just didn't participate. That's gone now for younger generations. Now they have to actually use it to support it. And it becomes a big challenge to try to appeal to people. Abraham, and if somebody else wants to jump in, please.
I wanted to ask a question, not of you, but of everybody else. I wanted to ask if any of you feel discomfort in this discussion, in what this represents for you, and that which is what might make you quiet. And I'll shut up.
So for
Miriam.
me,
I'm
it's an
sorry.
interesting dichotomy between the ethical aspect, the humanistic, the cultural, the social, and then you're taking out the religious. And I find that our struggle with the religious is valuable, and I'm a little disconcerted that you don't have that struggle as a conversation.
Miriam, do you want to also, I want to hear from you as well before I respond.
Yeah, I find this conversation very comforting, and I'm sorry, that's my dog, if you hear barking. I know, I just find it very comforting. I've always felt very comfortable with the community with Kehilat Hanahar. I was uncomfortable with my community growing up, which was conservative, and several other communities I've been in. My community in Derry, New Hampshire, where there are very few Jews, but we had a synagogue. That was very comforting. Almost everybody there was an interfaith marriage. My husband and I were one of the very few couples where we both identified as being Jewish. So I really welcome this discussion. Thank you.
I also welcome this discussion. I grew up conservative, and then eventually we joined a Reform synagogue when our kids were little. but I've always felt uncomfortable at services reciting the prayers. In fact, I prefer to read the Hebrew, even though I didn't understand it, because when I was reading the Hebrew, I wasn't saying praying to God. I was just reading these words. But when I saw the English translation, it always made me feel like I was faking it, because it wasn't really what I felt inside. But I do want to be part of a Jewish community because I feel very comfortable in a Jewish community, ethically, and I just feel like I fit in. But not having the God part of it feels just right to me. Thank you.
Susan?
I also feel that way. I mean, this is totally comfortable for me. I could fit in very well with the humanistic approach. So I like learning about it and hearing about it, and it would work for me. So.
Thanks.
And I also feel
Deborah,
very
and then
comfortable. Yeah, I feel like this is great. This is and actually a really wonderful thing. And Rabbi Dan also has always made me and my whole family feel comfortable, very open to all interpretations, whatever works for you. And I love the idea of thinking of the word God as goodness. I mean, I almost wish that's how everyone felt, because that's what it should be, is us trying to, I think, live our lives the best way we can, being as helpful as we can. And I've had several members in my family who did not believe in God, but were still Jewish, did maybe not everything that, a typical Jew does, did the holidays, did family gatherings, did, high holy days, things like that. And this just speaks to me. It allows you to still be Jewish in a way that works, I think, for everyone in this kind of modern society, where I think religion as a whole is becoming a little less popular. I don't know what the right word is for so many people. I just feel like it works.
Thank you. Thanks, Saul. Saul, yeah.
I came from an Orthodox Sephardic community. And after a while growing up, I rejected it completely. In fact, I rejected religion completely. But I slowly came back. And I think with Rabbi Diana and the community, it's more open. I still cannot accept the word God, because I feel God has been misused in so many ways. But I do believe in a spiritual presence. I do believe scientifically that there is some divine spirit, something that is pervading the universe. And I'm allowed to believe that in this community. It's not rejected. So I feel comfortable with some sort of a religious aspect, with a spiritual aspect.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I want to say that there are folks in our movement who would describe their connection to spirituality exactly as you did as well. But it sounds to me like you have an amazing community there where you can be open about what you do believe. And that's kind of my advocacy beyond our movement. I want us to be an option for people. And I recognize that for us, our movement is a bunch of sticklers who really don't want to say that word. But I'm obviously in community and family with many Jews who share our philosophy or describe the universe the way Saul just did, and say things like, well, these are the words my ancestors used. So even if I have a different relationship to the words, I want to keep using these words because these are the words my ancestors used. And I get it. And when I am in theistic Jewish prayer settings, which of course I am, because I was late with my kids. All of my friends' kids have had bar and bat mitzvahs. So of course I went. And when I hear the Shema, I get goosebumps because I know those were the last words of hundreds of thousands of Jews as they were marched off to their death, during the Holocaust. And when I hear the mourner's Kaddish, it moves me very much emotionally. And it doesn't matter what those words are. But then the rest of the service, I'm kind of banging my head against the pew in front of me. And that's me. And I want us to have a space in the community. But I also would never say to solve, no, that's wrong, because it's not wrong. That's the agnosticism that I present, which is, I think that that is absolutely a possibility. I think one day we might prove it one way or another through science, but until that time, if that's your belief and it provides you with comfort, then that's great. And as long as you're not using it as a stick to beat me, which is what happens in the far right of religion in this country, that's not what's happening here. And so I don't want to take away anybody's comfort. My wife is from Japan, so they don't have this God concept, this monotheistic God concept at all, but they have a kind of naturalistic view. They actually have an overlay of Shintoism and Buddhism. And when we lost our Chihuahua and it was sudden and very sad and tragic, we were both very upset, and she said, I feel like I'll see him again. And she was alluding to a belief in reincarnation. And I'm not going to say to her, no, you won't. It provides her with comfort and maybe, and so that kind of thing, I don't want to be that kind of like avenging atheist personality, which exists out there. And frankly, I think they give atheism a bad name. I'd rather have these kind of conversations. And I'll tell you that one of the most profound things I experienced, I was in my wife and I took a program in New York City. It's called Derech Torah, the Way of the Torah, run out of the 92nd Street Y. It's one of the longest standing outreach programs to intermarried couples. It's an 8-month educational program that's basically intro to Judaism. And one of the sessions, the student rabbi at the time, she's a rabbi now, asked us to line the room based on your belief in God. And if you believe in the old vision of God as an old man with a beard on a throne, stand here. And if you're absolutely certain that there is no God, stand here. And then everybody else kind of line up in the spectrum in between. And of course I was at one end of it, but there was somebody at the old man with the beard on a throne end, and then the whole class almost evenly spread out between us. And we just stood there and looked at each other and recognized that we're all coming here in community around shared values, around shared history and heritage and identity, and felt like, okay, this is great. I have a place along this spectrum, but nobody here is going to judge me because we're all kind of at these different points along the spectrum. And, maybe me and the person who believed in the God on the throne could have debated, but that wasn't, that didn't even come up. It was just like, oh, wow, okay, this religion or peoplehood allows for that kind of spectrum. And I think that it sounds like your community understands that, which I think is great. My advocacy outside of my movement is I'd love to see more of the organized Jewish community have that conversation and recognize that spectrum, because that's who the Jews are. And people like me are often feeling like we're on the outside because the full spectrum is not acknowledged.
I have a question. How do the non-Jewish spouses in the intermarriage feel in your congregation as compared to, like, your example was just so beautiful about the Chihuahua and your wife finding within herself her way of this journey. And that's very beautiful, because I think that's extremely helpful. But one of the things I see with intermarriage, I have with mine, and it's no matter where it is that you as the Jew still are the rooting. You still have the ancestry. Even so, how does your wife or all of these spouses, does this turn toward humanism really level the playing field, or is it still unlevel? And how does it differ from ethical culture? Because I think that was their point of their existence, was
right.
leveling the playing field.
So the quick answer on ethical culture is that, which, by the way, if you don't know the history of the ethical culture movement, it was founded by a rabbi, Felix Adler, who was the son of a rabbi who I believe was the rabbi at the congregation that I got married in New York City, and he was to inherit his pulpit, which I guess is maybe how they did things back then. But his first sermon, or one of his earliest sermons, was about his own atheism, and they said, no, you're not going to be our rabbi. And so he founded Ethical Culture. But what he did was pull out anything specific to Judaism and tried to make it a genuinely universal non-theistic religion, which they are. So there's nothing, a lot of Jews are involved, but there's nothing inherently Jewish about anything that they're saying. So that's the big difference for us. And then as far as how the intermarried feel in our movement, I would say that there's unfortunately two answers. And it's kind of like the difference between the event itself, the game itself, and then the spectacle around the game. And so the game itself is like whether or not the Yankees win, but the spectacle itself is the crowd, the chanting, the peanuts being sold, like what else is happening around. So the game itself, Humanistic Judaism, there's nothing in it that prevents the spouses who aren't Jewish from participating fully. We don't do aliyot to the Torah, right? We don't call people to say blessings over the Torah. There's nothing, literally nothing, that is reserved only for Jewish people that people who aren't Jewish can't do. Everybody can do everything in our movement. And actually, my immediate past president of my board would not be recognized as formally Jewish by any other denomination. Maybe, Reform and Recon, if they accepted our we call it adoption, our conversion. But he came in through our movement, and he was my board president, and he was as knowledgeable as anybody about Judaism. So on the one hand, there's nothing as far as inclusion or prevention and so on. But the spectacle itself, though, is sometimes problematic because there are people who, now that they've found a home where they can speak openly about their atheism, agnosticism, free thought, there's a lot of different identities around this, may denigrate believers, which I don't. I try not to, and I try to change this culture. But it's a safe space, right? It's like along the models of safe space where, if marginalized population is denigrating the majority that has marginalized them, that sometimes happens in safe spaces, and I'm trying to work on that. But I do understand sometimes our non-Jewish spouses have heard all this talk, and they themselves are believers, right? Because you might have an humanistic Jew married to somebody who believes in Christianity. And I want our movement to be comfortable for them. But I've heard at least one or two folks who felt pushed away because we were so openly non-theistic. And so that's the balancing act. But the point is, for me, moving forward, I think, I know from statistics, most intermarried couples are two people who they lean secular. And I want to, just kind of appeal and address that. But it's something I think about a lot. And as far as my wife's connection to Judaism, she's a culinary Jew. She eats all the food. She says to me that she ate, she likes chopped liver. She eats gefilte fish. She says, I'm as Jewish as you are. So.
Jen has her hand up. I think Paul froze. Paul, are you there? Maybe he'll come back in a moment. Maybe he'll notice it and then sign in and sign back.
Hi, I think I lost my connection. I'm back.
Welcome back.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, sorry, Jennifer, I didn't hear anything.
I didn't say anything, so we're all good. I want to say thank you for offering this program today. And it's really, when you said religious privilege, it gave me pause. I have some sadness just listening to everyone talk about their stories and how people's concepts and understanding of God has separated, right? And driven people apart. And I'm really grateful just to be able to talk about this. It's really given me a lot to think about, and it's really big and there's a lot of layers, and I'm not really going to be very good at articulating it, so I'm not going to, but I will be thinking about these ideas and concepts for a long time. And I look forward to diving in a little bit deeper. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I'm happy to be a resource beyond just this call if I can be of any help. And I think I did see something in the chat about resources to talk about this with kids, and I'll go look for that as well. We have kids' schools. I haven't dug in deeply on what the curriculum is as far as opening up the conversation around God. I know our kids get into it fairly early on though. Diana?
I appreciate your sharing your experience of feeling ostracized and not met as a child. And I actually feel like it's one of the reasons it's important for us to, when we talk at our Shul school about the different ways people can believe or not believe as being equally valid. Because I actually think if you're setting the intention that someone should feel a certain way and they don't, that is as if someone should be straight and they're not. That's my whole thing about orientation. So I actually feel like your experience didn't do justice to your inner experience of life. And that, I think, as much as I think that some kid who does feel that there is something divine out there should also be met. So I kind of feel like this is why I think that there's a real necessity to have these discussions and to show children and adults that there's just many different ways of relating to our tradition. But like, you're an example of someone who suffered from it. And I see that. It kind of helps me going forward to really feel strongly still about making different ways of being kind of and feeling and thinking validated as equally Jewish,
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. It's not.
No, I
not an easy
appreciate
thing.
that so much. And I'll tell you that all of us in our movement have heard, some of us more often than not, this expression, how can you be Jewish if you don't believe in God? Like all of us who have tried to describe what humanistic Judaism is, have received that response. And in my position now, professionally, I hear it a lot, like on comments on things we post on Facebook and so on. And it's just this constant kind of trying to explain, and especially when it comes from someone to the left of orthodoxy, what God do you believe in? Tell me about the God that you believe in, because in most cases, it's not that vengeful, angry male God who lifted us out of Egypt with an outstretched arm, like for the most part. So so you don't believe in that God either, right? So we both don't believe in that God. Tell me about, but the initial reaction from a lot of people is, well, then you're not Jewish. And I know, look, I have all of the privilege of being white male in America, and I recognize that. And this is nothing like what my friends who are Jewish and of color experience, of how can you be Jewish if you're Black? 100 times worse, let me just put that out there. And that happens to them all the time. But this is when, you talk about the marginalizing people, it's that questioning of, what kind of Jew are you? And I got it as an intermarried Jew, anything that deviates from this kind of idealized vision of a Jewish family as being two straight people married with children, educating them Jewish, like that family configuration is maybe 20% of our community. So anything that deviates from that idealized vision, which is operationalized by organized Judaism in a lot of ways. So if I can, it really does make me feel very encouraged to hear your feedback, and that's something you'll keep in mind.
Can I just say one quick thing? It brought me back to now Rabbi Diana is very different, but when Neil and I got married, I had the Reform rabbi from my growing up who married us. And right before, he must have asked a question like about God. And I said, well, I don't believe in God. And he said, then I can't marry you. And I said, okay, never mind, I do. I'll never forget that. It's always stuck with me. So, that's just an example of that in some way.
It's so interesting, and where people maintain these lines that, why, but I have my lines, and so some people have asked, I don't know why, provocatively, and I'm glad nobody here asked it, but they said, well, what about when I talk about that anybody can come up and say one of our blessings? And they said, well, what about a Jew for Jesus? And I'm like, I don't think a Jew for Jesus is Jewish automatically. If they are of Jewish ancestry and they say they're Jewish, that's maybe another story. But my answer is, if they're saying our liturgy, they can say it. They're welcome to say it. We're not inviting them up to proselytize to us about Jews for Jesus. And it goes all down the line. When I was doing this in a pluralistic setting, they said, well, what if intermarried families want to come up on the bima during their kids' bar and bat mitzvah? Like, that's the line that some synagogues hold for them. And for them, it feels like such a crossing of the line to allow that. And for us, maybe it feels like just a ridiculous question. So everybody has to kind of grapple with, where is my line? Because we all have it. And then why am I holding on to that line so strongly? Or what kind of accommodations can I make anyway? These are just people we're talking about, one way or the other. But thank you. I think it's a real challenge. And one story that I just also wanted to share, which came up because, like Judy was talking about, the knowledge, right? You want people to have the knowledge. And I used to think, before I really understood humanistic Judaism, that I would put my kids through the same hell I went through, and I would just hope that they reject it in the same way that I reject it. And because then they know what they're rejecting, right? And I've heard that, at least let them know what they're rejecting. I work with a rabbi named Miriam Jarris at Society for Humanistic Judaism, and she was speaking to an audience very early on in my tenure, and it was such a great analogy. She asked, what other endeavors in life do you make your kids do in the hopes that they reject it? Do you force them to take piano lessons and hope that they hate piano? There's nothing else that you do in that regard. Why would you do it with this? The goal is to give them something they love. And then if they want to dive deeper, they dive deeper on it. So that was really helpful in me thinking about, we don't scrub God. Our friends, our family, our neighbors all are grappling with this concept as well. We want to grapple with it as well. But we're doing it from one position, and other groups are doing it from a different position. So,
Paul, I want to say to you that I hope that your movement is successful in sharing the love of Judaism with your children, because I think as parents and grandparents, we all want to be able to pass our love down. The how is different. And I'll give you a little story. When I was pregnant with my son, and I had an obstetrician in New York, and we were talking about a Brit. And because my husband isn't Jewish, and I actually really don't like Brits celebrating that whole thing. So I said to him, do the circumcision in the hospital. He said, I'll say a bracha. I said, we got it. So he did. And then he came in and he said to me, I want you to know, this is kind of like when I drive my kids to Hebrew school. Every time I drive them, they say, I hate going. And I say, I know, I hated going. And then his son said, well, why are we going? He said, so we can share the experience of you hating going and me hating taking you to go in the car. And that's our shared experience. So whichever way we pass it, whichever way, I'm glad that
I hear it.
And I hope that many of the people who were lost to it, because my son really hated their explanations, and he views himself as a historical Jew. He doesn't see any, but the history is very important, and Israel is very important that it survives. But you're giving us another way in, and for that I thank you. We all need to find more ways in, and I hope the interfaith people feel in their marriages. What I was getting at is, do they feel as comfortable as the Jews, the people who are Jewish? My husband eats the food too, but he's yet to feel the same, and he loves Rabbi Diana. and it's the most comfortable place he's been. But basically, he doesn't believe in God. He was raised as Catholic through Catholic high school, and he just doesn't. He loves all the traditions, all the holidays, but, you know, so maybe this would have worked for him. I don't know.
Diana?
I have a question. I don't understand how not believing in God gets to the continuity of the Jewish people getting down further on the list. Like, what does one have to do with the other? In other words, couldn't one still not believe in God, but still very much believe that Judaism per se is totally worth continuing as a high priority, and therefore the Jewish people, whether they were born Jewish or convert to Judaism or adopt Judaism, like, how is one related to the other? Is that just your opinion?
I'm not fully following the question. I would love for Judaism to continue on and provide meaning
earlier
for
you had
people.
said your highest priority isn't the continuity of the Jewish people. Universalism is a stronger pull. If your kids become, you know, if it was just a blip in their identity,
Right.
it's sad, but it's not like, and I guess I figure, is that just you, or is there something about secular Judaism or that
So I would say it's not even secular Judaism. I think Reform Recon, I think if you poll Recon, what are the most important things you wish for your kids? Who's not going to put health first?
Oh, no,
You
no,
know?
no, not about health,
Right.
but I mean, like, I guess what I of course, health first, but I thought I heard you say that, like, if it just becomes a blip, and not just for your kids, but I guess I'm wondering.
I got it.
Yeah.
I see where you're coming.
Yeah.
So to me, and this is what I said at the beginning about a cultural approach, and there's no zero-sum game about culture. There's zero-sum game about monotheistic religion. You know, at a certain point, a believing Jew married to a believing Christian, we know where that point comes. Is Jesus Messiah, right? There's a zero-sum game about that. Either you believe he is or he isn't, and that's with culture, there's no limit to how much you can do except the hours in the day and your interest in it. So for me, for my vision moving forward in the future, you know, right now, my kids are obviously deeply immersed in American culture, but they're also getting a Japanese cultural education and a Jewish cultural education. And if my son, like, forget the analogy of moving back to Japan, let's say he meets someone in New York who's half Guatemalan and half Irish, and their kids now have 4 heritages to choose from plus American. And some would say that that's impossible and give up at that point, and then they just become a bland, the American melting pot, and they're nothing. Right? I don't believe in that. I don't think people become nothing. I think they pull from their background or from other backgrounds of what is meaningful for them. So when I think about the future of Judaism, I think this is about providing meaning for people. And as I said about, you know, the Western Wall, if you have that connection already built in, it's just an easier leap to find meaning. I don't find, you know, I didn't grow up with Japanese, but there are aspects of Japanese culture that I find very profound and meaningful, and I'll never be Japanese. So it's like, I feel like certainly my work and the Jewish communal, the organized world, the goal is provide meaning. And you can draw, as you said, you can choose Judaism even if you're not Jewish. But I understand if someone says, well, you're giving them too many choices, right? If both parents are Jewish and all they know is the Jewish community, then they're going to be Jewish, right? That was the operating assumption of the organized Jewish community. That's what the big push for in marriage for 5 decades was. Don't give them any other choice, right? Or like, again, I've been working in the community for a couple of decades now, and the main initiatives like Birthright Israel or Jewish summer camps or Jewish day schools is all about segregation. It's all about keep the Jews together, then they'll meet each other, they'll marry each other. Doesn't matter whether they believe in God or not, right? The actual meaning doesn't matter. Just get them together ethnically, like keep them in the same zone, right? And that I completely reject, and it makes it much harder. But this, I think the hard part is the part that's worth it, which is why do it? What is the meaning? What is the benefit? How do you make the world a better place? To me, it's just 3 things. How do I improve my life? How do I improve my family's life? Or how do I make the world a better place? And that's like a 2/3 selfish, 1/3 altruistic ratio, which I feel is fair for human beings. And, you know, if we can answer those questions, here's how being part of this community makes the world a better place, or here's how this improves your life or the life of your family. So I hear, you know, to me, the word secular is used by the organized Jewish community as synonymous with gone, out, you know, outside of Judaism and not finding meaning or identity in Judaism. And I don't hear that at all in the word secular, but I hear like it's in competition now with anything else you want to do. And I didn't invent that. And spiritual people are in that competition too, because there's the whole like Jew boom movement where Jews found meaning in Buddhism and they pulled from other places. And that's great. You know, there's in that regard, there's no conflict. So that's kind of my approach is the more the merrier, right? The more the merrier. And then will there be a loss if they don't go with the Jewish and they go with the Japanese, Guatemalan, Irish background? Yeah, a little bit. But if they're finding meaning in that, how can I complain? And I think that that's the case, especially in my parents' generation, who's had their kids intermarry at such high rates, and they were upset about it at first, and then they see what great people their grandchildren are, and they say, you know what, I thought that was the number one value, and it wasn't the number one value, and now I'm just going to try to do the best I can. And they do Hanukkah at my house, and it means something to them, and they'll always remember it. They have Jewish grandparents, that means something to them, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you.
Sure. So I am going to have to say goodbye, but as I said, I'm available. Reach out to me. I would love to see these kind of conversations happening in other communities, and I'm happy to just, it's easy because all I'm doing is just telling you what my own truth is. I'm not telling you what your truth needs to be. So I'm happy to do this with other folks or individually if I can be of help.
Paul, can you put your email into the chat? Can you
Sure.
put your email into the chat?
Yes, it's a very creative one. It's my name plus my organization.
Okay.
Paul Golin at shj.org.
Beautiful.
So yeah, please be in touch.
Yes.
Thank you, Jerry, for
Thank you
bringing
all.
Paul to our community. Jerry's the one who went to the conference and raved about.
It sounds like you guys have a great community, and I'm really appreciative to hear about it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye bye.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Ooh.